My name is Aisha Becker-Burrowes, and I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of FEMINST, which is the largest platform really dedicated to women, girls, and gender-expansive people. We reach over 25 million a month, and that's really around storytelling and mobilizing our communities around the issues that matter to us and our audience. But I'm also a social impact consultant and strategist, having really come from a background in film and television. And this is surprisingly my first time at Sundance, despite all of that. What a whirlwind. But also what a truly incredible, thank you. A really pertinent time to be here, right? To be at the Solidarity House. I will read a little bit more about the Solidarity House. The Solidarity House is both a space and practice, creating meaningful alignment where imagination meets infrastructure and solidarity becomes strategy. This gathering is designed to strengthen our collective capacity to imagine and to build the future of independent storytelling and co-design pathways towards a more sustainable and equitable creative future that centers repair, liberation, and sovereignty. There is live captioning available through Coda, a web-based tool accessible on your device. It doesn't require an account or logins. And our unique links are available via the QR codes posted around the room or on our website, solidarityhouse.com/schedule. This panel is called Shield and Sustain, the Future of Artist Safety. And I think it's an incredibly important time to be having that conversation, right? To be having this conversation. And I think as I was reflecting on this particular moment in time that we're in, not just for me as my first time at Sundance, but also collectively, right? And reflecting on this conversation today, I was really thinking about how fascism really relies on story, right? On myth, on who are the villains, right? Who are the heroes, and maybe where you should be fearful, who you should be afraid of, but also on your powerlessness. And so, fascism also thrives on censorship and censoring that opposes that story. I know, at FEMINST, we see a lot of censorship on reproductive justice, on abortion stories, on immigration, on Palestine. And so this conversation is on artist safety with increased censorship. I think it's especially important that we're having this conversation now. And I think the role of an artist, right, is also similar to the role of an activist, which is to imagine, right, to imagine a more liberated future. And so our artist safety is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. And I think there's a lot of different ways that we can be thinking about safety. And so I'm super excited to be in conversation with these incredible panelists here today. I think I'd love if we could go around and maybe each of you could just share a little bit more about who you are, your name, your pronouns, and your work before we get into it.
You just say if I sat beside you, I have to go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Michael Royston. I'm the founder of the Queer Livelihoods Project, and we're a private fund that supports LGBTQ artists and designers around the world. So we work in a lot of complex conflict settings. We specifically look at funding in areas that people don't necessarily get funding into. So when I say we fund in Southern Africa, it's not necessarily South Africa, it's Botswana, it's Lesotho. We really try to go where, we see kind of two pillars of can we make an impact in kind of a repressive regime or in fascism or in early democracy settings. So we fund a lot of work in Taiwan. I think it's really important right now with the conversation, like Taiwan sovereignty is really important, and the work and queer artists and have been really pushing democracy for so long in Taiwan, and with having the first Asian country to have LGBTQ marriage, being able to really support that. So that's what we do. We move about $3 million a year in capital, and we have about 200 grantees. And we show up in a lot of interesting spaces. We fund a lot of, just kind of getting into safety quickly. We fund a lot of parties And that's on the sidelines of a lot of big events. So at the Skull World Forum, we host the LGBTQ party. At UNGA every year, we host an LGBTQ party. So we show up in other like random spaces like that. And that's really about bringing together the collective safety of the community so that we can just like let our hair down and hang out.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is April Rain. I guess I'm most well known for creating the hashtag Oscar So White back in 2015. Thank you. Since then, I have been in the strategic communications and crisis communications space, helping brands, organizations, individuals tell their story better. Primarily right now, I am working with a fandom engine is online called Spill. Spill is we are nearing a million downloads. We are a safe space for underrepresented, multicultural, queer people. We are most interested in community and creativity. Unlike some of the larger social media platforms you may know of, we are very proud of our terms of service, and they're right there on our community guidelines page, so you don't have to worry. And so I am here representing Spill, especially interested in creators, vertical series, micro dramas, a place where you can go and place your art and feel safe, which I think is very relevant for our talk today, because you're not going to have a white nationalist, underneath your post saying something ugly because they just don't belong there. So I'm very happy to be here, and let's continue conversation. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. Thank you both for your work. Thank you all for your work. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Karim Ahmad. I guess I'm wearing a couple of hats here. I'm on the board of OTV, which is one of the Solidarity House Coalition partners. For folks that don't know OTV, it's an independent media arts incubator, an artist incubator, an independent streaming platform, and very values driven, very rooted in care and artist care in particular. I'm also a producer and the founder of a narrative change studio called Utopia Studio, where we produce intentionally political stories in pop culture packages is how we define what we do. The first film on our slate is in theaters right now. It's called The Voice of Hind Rajab, directed by Kauthar Ben-Hania. Thank you so much. It's Oscar nominated.
Woohoo.
Thank you.
Well deserved.
Sorry?
Well deserved.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, Kauthar's amazing. She's an incredible talent, and the story is obviously incredibly moving and heartbreaking. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. My name's from Undocumented Filmmakers Collective. The organization that our mission really is to amplify, uplift, and spread awareness on how you can work and uplift and create pathways for undocumented immigrants in filmmaking careers that is completely legal and unbeknownst to popular narratives. And also, I'm just really happy to be sitting on this panel and being at Sundance because Sundance was our early partners to really uplift and create pathways for removal of citizenship requirements for undocumented immigrant filmmakers. And Karim was in the early stages of all of that. And full circle moment, we do have a member who was an assistant editor for American Pachuco. So again, like really uplifting the fact that like what brings me joy is being surrounded like people like yourself who are willing to not say no, but willing to say, how can we do this and learn about how to combat the really harmful narratives that immigrants are stealing jobs or it's illegal to work with immigrants. And the bottom line really is if we champion things in terms of better safety and protocols and for immigrants and undocumented people, it actually helps everyone. And so just really doing that narrative shift in work is really important. And I'm also a filmmaker, producer, and I have I have a feature film on PBS called From Here, From There that profiles the Supreme Court case on DACA. So if you want to be more informed about the policies that are rescinding our communities and affecting our communities right now, that is available for education purposes.
Thank you all. Yeah, a round of applause. Um, so as a communications person and like a social impact strategist, we're all into narrative and storytelling, right? So that means that language is really important to us. And so this panel is on safety. Um, and before we get into that, I would love to know how each of you define safety.
Yeah, I think, at QLP, we define safety for us is for our artists and designers to be able to do their work and to make equitable dollars for that. And so we always talk about if you're I come from like the international development space a lot, so we talk about like log frames, and everyone always thinks that like our output, right, is like art and culture. And I would always say, like, our output is art and culture, but our impact is actually economic justice. So we want LGBTQ artists and designers to be making equal dollars to what our, straight counterparts are. And we see that show up in a lot of different spaces. Just even like an artist who is trying to sell in a market in Thailand, is probably selling something at like $200 or $300. But if it was able to go to a commercial gallery in San Francisco, for instance, we could be selling it for $2,000, $3,000. And that's really important because a lot of LGBTQ individuals do not have access to those markets. And so we're also trying to create those markets because if they don't exist. And so for us, it's like, I always say, like, great if someone, humans' rights are really important, obviously, and great, like, marriage equality. But, like, if you don't have money, like, how are you going to pay for your wedding? Right. And so it kind of gets into like those, like, and I think like in the LGBTQ space, we go a lot of directions where we push a lot of money in the global space into human rights and defending laws, and not a lot of money is going into economic justice work. And I think that's really important because if we don't have the ability to, spend money and get the dollars, then we don't have seats at the table. And I think that's where like actual change can be made. And that's really like for us what safety like is having that equal dollar.
Mm.
I don't necessarily want to just keep going right back. I mean, I say, but here I am. Yeah, I think for me, the word safety, the definition changes based on context, right? So I think about ensuring that there are intimacy coordinators on the sets. Out of all, if we're talking from micro dramas to feature films, right? There should always be someone there to ensure that the person who is being disrobed feels safe. I think about spill and ensuring that when a creator brings their project to the platform, that they feel safe, that they are going to be protected, and be able to openly share the art that they've made. I think about intellectual property laws and ensuring that we inform creators and artists how to protect their work before it's too late. Once it's already out there, well, once your hashtag or once your video, whatever's already out there, it's gone, right? And then almost anybody can have use. So we need to talk about copyright protection, trademark protection, all of those things on the front end, so that people aren't benefiting financially and otherwise from your work. So those are a couple of examples that I can think of where we really need to think about safety, especially for emerging artists. I don't want to say young because it doesn't matter to me what age you are, but people who just may not have that information yet, but should get it as they're starting their career as an artist.
I'm going to break the cycle of going down. And I want to talk about like holistic safety for a filmmaker and also being someone who and also the subject matter of immigration being a hot topic that people want to cover. So first, in the holistic practice as a filmmaker, we often look at like what is stopping someone from their practice, their craft. And so what we ask questions like, how can we holistically support that and prevent you from realizing your pathway as a filmmaker? But then once your film is out, once you're in distribution, once people start marketing your films, then it's like, are you as a filmmaker compromised because you're sharing, the subject matter of your film? You're also an immigrant filmmaker. You're inviting other communities, and usually you're organizing in your local community to show your film because you're from the impacted community. And then it becomes, safety in the distribution side and the audience side. So it's like what we've experimented in even my own film is just a whole audience safety protocol screenings around um, how do we support and make sure that people even have the space to watch these films and the filmmakers themselves feel like, again, letting their hair down and feel comfortable to talk about their film and their subject matter, which is often so personal. So that is like a holistic side of like really tapping into where the filmmaker is at in their journey, whether it's research, production, post, and really understanding the safety around that. But then there's the other side where immigration is a topic where people want to cover that aren't from the lived experience and would inherently put people who they want as protagonists in very precarious situations for their personal gain. And that's what we're calling extractionary storytelling. And quite often, most people ask me, how can I help my protagonist feel safe? And I think that's a question for everyone here who isn't a part of the lived experience is what is your gain for telling this story? If it's your gain to gain accolades and to just kind of be like, I was the first to cover this story, I don't think you should be telling that story point blank, period. I think that it has to be a sincere, genuine rootedness in the protagonist safety above your film. And that is also like having that understanding and having that humanistic lens around filmmaking as well.
Anything? You don't have to.
I mean, I agree with so much of what's been said, and I think about safety in a very similar terms, especially to the way that you described it, Nicole. And I think that the way that it hits the ground for us in the work that we're doing at Utopia Studios, like particularly, it's probably most applicable to working with telling stories about like, politically quote unquote like controversial topics, right? Like essentially just sort of like values driven stories that tend to make the filmmakers that tell those stories targets. And so I know what the sort of like I know what unsafety looks like for that kind of experience. I think, I agree 100% with what you just said earlier about this idea that safety is very sort of temporary and very sort of fleeting and contextual. And so I think when I think about safety, I think about how do you mitigate and calculate risk because risk is ever present. And so I think, unfortunately, like it's really difficult to feel safe, but more broadly in terms of the context of making a film in that way. But I do feel like looking at it more broadly, when I think of like how do I define safety, I had to do some thinking about this actually. But I do feel like safety is solidarity in a lot of ways. And so when I think about safety, I think about spaces like this. And I think it's so important that spaces like this exist, particularly because so much of what we are trying to do in movement and in cultural organizing spaces has to be a lot more under the radar these days for our own safety. And so having physical spaces like this to be able to gather and organize, it just becomes that much more critical.
So it sounds like safety is economic, right? It's physical, it's in community, it's through care around some of the stories that are shared and how we share those, and who we choose to tell those stories. I think the sort of next question that I have is how does safety or the lack thereof maybe shape what stories actually get told? I don't know if anyone wants to answer this, but
I can speak to that in my own film From Here From There. I think transparently I was the worry wart producer. And the protagonist, he's on the news all the time. For context, his name is Luis Cortez Romero. He is a first undocumented Supreme Court litigator. So he's like suave in front of the camera. He's always on the news. He's familiar with like people interviewing him. So I think him as a protagonist, he has a lot of agency in terms of risk that I, as a filmmaker with this lived experience, don't even have. So it's like understanding even like where I feel unsafe and where he feels completely in his element is a conversation that him and I always have, which primarily what I've seen in patterns is mainly the film crew has all the liberty and the protagonist is scared. But in this way, I'm the one that's like, oh, I don't feel comfortable, and the protagonist is pushing their agency. And I think it's like it's a thing that we need to think about around, like, are the protagonists in our films prepared? Do they have like emergency plans prepared? Do they have the license to take these risks, or are we pushing them? And for me, I sometimes felt pushed from my film crew, and I would say, I'm quitting. I'm quitting. I don't want to be a part, because I felt like my sense of safety was also being compromised. So I think there's no rules to this. It's a honest conversation around all our worries, and having that space to do so. And thankfully, me and my film team have that synergy now, but it took a lot of fights to get there, and good fights, not bad ones. I mean, it could have been bad, but like, I think it got to us to trust, and I think ultimately that's what we need to like work towards, is like trusting each other and like laying it all out on the table.
I think from like an international standpoint too, we think a lot about the voices that are being told. Is there's not a lot of distribution for that, right? So when you look at like Southeast Asia context, for example, there's like very few production companies that are LGBTQ, and the ones that are often based in Thailand, Singapore, and places that you can get out and get access to. But even in Singapore, like, there's so much pressure that these producers get put under by the state government. And we fund a lot of film festivals throughout, like LGBTQ film festivals around the world. And that's really where like voices kind of come up and can be shown. And like a great example is the Beijing Film Festival, the LGBTQ film festival in Beijing. It's the only LGBTQ film festival left in mainland China. And a lot of people don't realize that it also, the festival itself is only, the films are only shown inside consulates, because you can't show LGBTQ films in a theater. And so what happens is the state government actually like stands outside and takes names down of the people coming out. So like they're protected inside the French consulate, right? But the moment you step out, and so that, is really, and so then if you are a Chinese filmmaker, it's like, well, where do I show my film? Right? My local market isn't going to be the one. And then trying to break into like a US market is very difficult. And so we're really looking at safety in like that kind of way of like, how do we, and then like what stories get told, because, in very complex areas, like the voices aren't being told. And there was just an amazing film that was done in Iran about a trans individual. It was a fictional film, and it was filmed on location. And like, to do that like was massive, and trying to get as many people like involved in it, and to also like on the ground people working on it didn't even realize what they were working on, because like they couldn't, because it would put them at risk. So I think there's just a lot of situations that we see, and we work with our grantees on that, like how are you safe. And I think like that's the other thing is contingency plans. We talk about like, how do you get out and where are you going, because the answer isn't the United States anymore, right? So it's like like, where are you going? And like, so many of our grantees end up in Germany, and like we have a thriving community of folks living in Berlin, but like our spaces of safety are also starting to close out. Like, you can't just see like, okay, I'll get you a flight to America if something shit hits the fan. Like, it's got to be a little more complicated now.
There's a lot, what both of you are saying really reminds me of just like the value of allyship. And not to kind of bring it back to solidarity, but like, you and I were on a panel talking about something very similar to this a couple of months ago that Firelight had put on. And I remember really clearly what Loida, the president of Firelight, said in terms of the way that she defined solidarity at the beginning of that session, which is about like solidarity involves risk. And so this idea of shared risk. And I think that what you've both said, it reminds me of a project that we had worked on that was trying to tell the story of the way that the Chinese Communist Party was oppressing the Uyghurs in East Turkestan, and the nature and lived experience of the open air prison camps over there. And it was a really challenging story to tell for obvious reasons, because there's so much transnational repression that happens for even Uyghurs that leave the region, are able to get out. And so it's really impossible for them to be able to tell their own story. And so there needs to be some facilitation from folks with more privilege and access to resources to be able to tell that story and figure out a way to do it that is authentic to their experience, but that also helps it travel. And that, I think, is also something that I know that like our director for this current film that we're working on, that Cowther directed, that she was also very attentive to, is like, how do I be an ally to a community and manifest their voices and figure out a way to center people whose authentic lived experience that is in the storytelling and co-create the story with them as opposed to dictate it from the outside. And I feel like that also is another kind of manifestation of like, how do you rebalance the danger in the erasure of stories not being told, to your question, based on a lack of safety of the folks that are most directly targeted.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, we've all mentioned it, right? We know what current moment we're living in. And I would love to maybe just name what risks feel newly intensified to you all in this moment that maybe didn't exist 5 years ago. Maybe April, I can start with you since you created this industry-wide reckoning with hashtag Oscars So White. And yet now we're seeing a very real rollback of DEI commitments, right? That's rooted in fear under this administration and a whole host of things. So I'm curious, yeah, what feels newly intensified? And also, I think with DEI as being a form of protection for many artists, right? For marginalized folks in particular. Yeah, and it's sort of becoming politically inconvenient or financially deprioritized. So I'd love to start with you.
Thank you for that. They're killing white folks now, right? So the whole game has changed. The black and brown folks, the queer folks that have been persecuted for decades and decades. This feels eerily familiar. And yet there's a whole additional level now, because if white women are not protected in this country, if straight white men are not protected in this country, then all bets are off for everybody. And I think that's what the real concern is. With DEI, now that melted creamsicle is back in office, um, I think everyone is in two different buckets. There are the folks who was like, okay, we don't have to think about that anymore, and let's go back to where we were, 8 years ago, let's say. And then there's the other bucket of people who are still very interested in telling these stories of under-resourced, underrepresented, marginalized communities, but they don't want to deal with the backlash. And somehow being awake, i.e. woke, is now a bad word. So as we talk about language and what it means to sort of reclaim, and go back to maybe the Merriam-Webster's definition of what things are, we have to be incredibly thoughtful. So, you were speaking about allyship. And as I have these conversations, I'm looking for accomplices, not just allies, right? If you call yourself an ally, you are not one every single time. The folks who, remember back in the day when there was a little safety pin, or, we're going to wear the pink hats, the pea hats, and then we're going to go out, and we don't need any of that, right? We need actual revolution in this time. And I think it's incredibly important that we all attempt to uplift communities that we don't belong, to which we don't belong. So for me, an ally is a person who stands in the gap without expectation of reward or even acknowledgement, for someone in a community that is not their own, right? And we all have the opportunity. I attempt to live my life, attempting to better the world for disabled Black trans women. And I pick them because they are the most marginalized, especially in this country. And so if I am doing something that I think is going to help them, then whatever the phrase is, a rising tide will lift all boats, right? And so everybody is going to be better. So really the question is, we don't need to talk about DEI, right? Because just saying, the acronym or the words that make up the acronym is going to turn everybody off. That's like when I was talking about Oscar So White incessantly, I never mentioned race or racism, because that just turns people off immediately. So the way I have these conversations now, again, talking about language, is we want to tell a comprehensive story. Not a Black story, not a disabled story, not a queer story, a comprehensive story, because it's much harder for someone to come back and say, oh, no, I only want to tell half the story. Right? That sounds crazy, from a baseline. And so when you can get to that point, I think it makes it a lot easier to still do the work, but under a different framework.
Thank you. Karim, I'm going to switch over to you. You executive produced The Voice of Hind Rajab, a film that we all know carries immense weight and urgency. And so what did it mean to make a film about Palestine in this moment, to have the global stage of the Oscars? And how did you navigate the very real risks, and your team navigate the very real risks, both creatively, emotionally, politically, that came with telling a story like hers?
Yeah, that's thank you for that. That's a big question of a lot of it. And as an EP, I'm less on the ground with this work than Kauthar is, and a lot of the producing team is, but I can do my best to sort of talk through like what they did specifically. But a lot of it was done in community with like the broader team of the film. And so I spoke a little bit earlier around this idea of having to kind of make films and organize in secret. And I think that was very much like the practice with this film. It was made very much in secret, and it happened very quickly. I mean, the anniversary of Hind's murder is January 29th, which is less than a year ago. So between her murder, Kauthar learning of the story, reaching out to the Palestinian Red Crescent, to developing a relationship with Hind's mother, Wissam, to being in discussion with them, having a lot of discussion around permission given to tell the story, which is obviously a lengthy and involved process and not something to be entered into lightly. But Wissam was very positive around the film and really wanted Hind's legacy to stand for something and to mean something for broader global impact. Um, and so the film very quickly went into production. Outside, the film was shot in Tunisia, like in a very sort of lockdown environment with no publicity. And I think, the producers had a lot of intention towards making sure that, there was a lot of uh, creative autonomy taken with the film, but also apart from scrutiny. And so there was no publicity around the film. There was a lot of secrecy around making sure that there was no communication about what the film was, that it existed, literally until like the day that the film, it premiered in Berlin last fall, or not Berlin, Venice. Um, and so until the announcement was made, that was when the film went public. Um, Prior to that, there was a lot of analysis just around like what is the public presence of everyone who's involved in this film, because it would be so easy to target anyone who's involved in the film in a variety of different ways. And so we had, risk assessment folks kind of come in, and security specialists, and, like scrutinizing everyone's social media, and, looking at just like what are the possible ways that like people will come for you, like for being associated with this film. Um, and so we were very careful with all of that. And that was, it was a very robust effort to make sure that we did that. What did I miss? What was the rest of the
No,
question?
that was helpful.
Okay.
Anything you learned through that process, or was surprised by, maybe?
I mean, I think a lot about this, and I feel like I've been talking a lot about this just with folks in this room and other rooms over the last couple of days, but like that experience is not unique. I think increasingly so many of us are having to make films like under those constraints and be very, very under the radar with what we do, because being an artist right now, particularly telling a story that comes from a place of values, that has any kind of sort of political, and define political like very broadly, right? Like, I think it's weird to call some of these things political films, because it's really just about like telling a story that embodies values that you hold about your lived experience or the communities that you're a part of. But increasingly, like those stories and the people telling those stories are targets. And so, um, a lot of filmmakers we have to unlearn, I think, a lot of the things that we've been taught about how you make a film, which is like, communicate with a lot of institutions, be very public about what you're doing, like develop an audience, like while you're in production around the thing, like post a lot on social media, and like, institutions also want to be very public in terms of like, here are the great films that I'm supporting. Look at all these marginalized filmmakers that we're supporting and these important stories that we're telling. And like, we're having to sort of like teach these institutions that like, no, don't do that. Like, you're putting people at risk when you do that. And so I think filmmakers need to like, we need to be learning again how to, build community under the radar in secret. And I think institutions also need to learn to, and particularly funders need to, and many of them are actually engaging in this work. I've been having conversations with a few funders here that are, really doing the work under the radar in ways that are really necessary. But to be able to, like, resource artists and particular causes and creative works in this very sort of like non-performative way, that I think so many institutions are under pressure to do, to like virtue signal in certain ways. And so that has been something that not just this film, but I think the way that talking about the experience of making this film resonates with the experiences of so many other filmmakers that I talk to, like, makes it so clear how ubiquitous that need is right now.
Yeah. And Nicole, I know that you probably resonate with a lot of that. And so I'm curious, as someone who works with a lot of undocumented filmmakers, how do you navigate safety for your community as well?
There was this camp before, and I'm gonna take you guys back with like immigrants' rights organizing first. I come from the quote unquote elder generation of immigrants' rights organizing, where it started in like 2000, early 2000s. And there was a belief that the more explicit you were, the more out there you were, the more protected you were. And to Karim's point, now it's no longer the case. But we can't unlearn all those things very quickly. So there's still a camp of people. The more loud we are, the more out there we are, the more protected we are. And then there's a camp of people who are just like, I don't want to know. I don't want to be known. I want to be under the radar. And I think it's a personal choice when it comes to those safeties. It's also who you're connected to or what you're responsible for. Do you have family? Do you take care of your family? Are you the primary caregiver? There's a lot of like movements across the board that are personal decisions. So I think safety is like a personal risk assessment and communicating your personal risk assessment to others. But in essence, so like in our collective, there's people in our collective that are very in that camp of like, I'm gonna stay loud. It's really hard for me to scrub all the years of work that I've been doing anyways. And it's really like difficult when you're partnering with like experts around risk assessment and them saying, well, you can't scrub half of the things that you have online. So then you take a position there and say, okay, well, they're gonna find me anyway, you know? And there is also that camp that a lot of us are in databases, government databases, because we pay taxes, because we have to go to court hearings, because we have to renew paperwork. So there is also that camp around like, well, they have all the information they need. So like, come if you want. Well, like, it's like, are you going to drive yourself mad when they already have all the tools at their disposal to access you? So there's also that camp, right? But then there's another camp where, and that's where, American citizens now are learning that they're not in a database. But immigrants who are undocumented are in a database. So that's why there's Americans who are getting detained because there's no database for you guys. So they are targeting immigrants. And if you look like an immigrant and they don't see you in a database, they assume that you are undocumented. Whereas the people who have been undocumented, who have been in DHS's databases, they can find us immediately. We have to go turn in paperwork. So what we're living in is like that fine line of like, how visible do we really want to be and how invisible do we want to be? And I think it's a really like a personal decision around how how mad are you going to drive yourself for that and stop living? Because you can also inherit all of those anxieties and fully just stop being human as well.
Yeah. And, I know we're talking a lot about physical safety as well, under, this administration, but also prior to, like, let's be real. Um, and, the one thing that I think we haven't dug into quite as much is material safety. And so Adam, Michael, I think my question for you as someone whose work really does center on material safety, how does centering material safety change what stories get told?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like kind of going back to what I was talking about, before if you don't have the ability to acquire even, the materials that you need, right? I think like that's really like what we look at, and when we're trying to fund individuals is, how do we get you access to certain materials and how do we do that? And I think like that's so important, and we work with a queer Afghan woman who evacuated from Kabul, obviously, and she was one of the first female photographers in the National Museum in Kabul. And as the Taliban is coming towards the city, she's starting to get WhatsApp messages from the Taliban saying, "We're going to kill you." And she was able to, because she was a photographer, was able to get out up with the German embassy. And the Germans, unlike the Americans, were like the first out. Like, it was actually organized, unlike our massive failure of an evacuation. And as she's running still, even though it was organized, she drops her camera, and the camera gets broken, right? And this is her livelihood. And she ends up in Germany working with queer Afghan refugees. And almost 2 years into it, and I knew her in that context, 2 years into it, she's like, "I really want to talk to you." And I'm like, "Okay, like, yeah, And she's like, "I'm a photographer. I don't think you know that." And she tells me this story. And, she's like, "I'm ready to go back to being a photographer." And really what had happened over those 2 years is once the Taliban came in, they burned her photographs.
Wow.
They sent those the images of the burning to her on WhatsApp. And so her entire collection, except for a few pieces that were in Paris at the time, were completely destroyed. So we work with a lot of artists in thinking about like, how do you protect yourself in those ways? Like, how do you make sure that your actual product and your art is either out of a country if it's in a conflict setting, or how do you get it out? And I think one thing that people don't realize in this whole tariff situation is like DHL doesn't work anymore. And DHL is the largest shipper in the continent of Africa. You cannot pretty much get anything like from like particularly West Africa. You cannot really get anything out of West Africa into the United States right now. So the way you have to do it, particularly in art, is you ship it to Europe and then you ship it back through like to the United States. But so these are these like complex like logistics that, are showing up. And that's what I think, like, kind of thinking of what Nicole was saying as well, like about like safety. It's like it creates a logistical nightmare. Like that's, I think, what people don't realize. And like that's what they're doing, is creating so much logistics that they think like that's going to bring us down. And it's down to even like people, everyday folks don't even realize like DHL doesn't work right now. And I think like that's like trying to like convey, like when people are like, we have an art gallery as well in San Francisco, and we've had to cancel 2 shows now, and people are like, "Oh, like why?" And I'm like, "'Cause I can't get stuff in." I can't even like get the stuff to show. And so I think that's really where we're at. And I just, at least for us as a foundation, like we're known, we've been put on influencer watch. People like don't know where our money comes from, so they connect it to dark money. My partner, like, unfortunately for me, my partner clerked for a Supreme Court justice, so then it's all linked and they think it's all part of this global conspiracy. And but that shows up in a way that like I can't get on an airplane to get back to the United States without secondary security. So I go to Hong Kong often. And I was in Hong Kong in January, right after the inauguration. And as I'm boarding the plane, they're like, "I need you to step over here." And I'm like, "Okay." And this guy stands up and he's like, "I'm with Homeland Security. Like, I have some questions for you." And I was like, "Well, what Homeland Security? Because we're in Hong Kong. This could be like China. It could be Hong Kong. It could be America." Like, and he's like, that's not important. Like, I'm the reason you're not going to get on that plane." And I'm like, "Dude, I have an apartment here. I don't have to get on this plane." I don't. And you're really just like one step away from me getting a glass of champagne. So like we got to figure this out. But it happens every time now. Like, I mean, I turn it into a laughing matter, but like my kids know. Like, we don't buy tickets together now when we go abroad because I have S's on the boarding pass. And then my partner is Chinese American. My kids are Chinese. I'm terrified about bringing them in and out of the country by myself. And so we have to like logistically think through all these things now, and that's something that we're trying to really get our grantees and our artists to understand too. Like, you can't just jump on a plane. Like, you've really got to think through what you're doing.
That, first of all, wow. I also just found out I'm on Influencer Watch, so good to know.
I feel like you made it if you get on Influencer Watch.
Maybe.
That's what I've been telling myself. Because we just got on, I have my own page and the foundation, and we got doxxed as soon as, because it was the day we got posted on it when Mandami was getting inaugurated. So he was on the main page and we were on the main page. I know. I was like, so we got a lot of hits on LinkedIn that day.
And it makes me wonder, actually, if each of you, because we've talked a lot about like physical safety and context setting and like what we're seeing across our communities. And so I think it'd be really helpful if each of you maybe shared some tools that you all are using or seeing that has sort of is resisting this increased censorship, but is also like increasing safety. Like I heard from you, having your family buy a different ticket, like what it could look like anything. But I'm just kind of curious for each of you, what's like one or two things that each of you are thinking about when it comes to that?
I think what's particularly hard about that question is that there's another article the next day about how that platform is not the safest. And so I think what I've just like registered is you can't perfect your safety as much as we want to. But you can delay and mitigate exposure. There's like no perfect way to like I'm just waiting for someone to release an article that says Signal is doing something crazy. Like, but we're living in that time where everything is compromised. And so for your mental health, just understand how to communicate the best of your ability. For me, coming to Sundance, I had like 2 weeks planning for my safety protocols. I had on-the-ground safety protocols. I had homes protocols. And then I looked one day and I was like, I'm exhausted for planning for this 4-day event, and I planned 2 weeks in advance for my safety. And then at the end of the day, it's like, it's not perfect. Something can still happen that blows this entire safety plan, but at least I know I tried my best. Like, we're all just trying our best with these logistical nightmares, and we're learning and shifting as we go. So I can't make like recommendations in terms of you should get a VPN and you should go on Signal, and well, those are best practices, but none of those things are necessarily concrete, like it's all just can be impenetrable, if you will.
Yeah.
I agree with a lot of what you just said, and I think I've given a couple examples earlier. Like, I'm not on social media as much as I used to be. I'm certainly not as transparent about the things that I'm doing before they're actually out in the world. So to that point of like mitigating risk until you absolutely have to be public about the work that you're doing. We talked about some security specialists. There's increasingly, thankfully, there's people that specialize in this kind of work. And I think it's important for us to be sharing the resources of the information of those people. The other thing I would just want to underline, and you mentioned it earlier, or alluded to it earlier, that I think like safety is expensive, like safety costs money, and so I think like it's important to resource people that you're collaborating with, that you're working with, that are unsafe or experience the most risk as much as possible, and so I think for our part within our company, what we're trying to do is just like really rethink like our revenue models in terms of like, and they rethink just the financial makeup of the way that we support projects. And so like really prioritizing like ownership and like, like filmmaker ownership and like independent distribution. So we have more control over, copyrights and things like that. And really thinking about like when we're developing new projects, like how can we experiment with things in like a publishing space that can create like secondary revenue streams for artists, for intellectual property that they're working with. And like when we're working on a film like The Voice of Hind Rajab, like how are we structuring the back end waterfall such that like the Palestinian Red Crescent and Wissam, Hind's mother, are like participating out of the profit like from day one. And so like knowing that those folks are like also like our collaborators that are like very much needing to have resources to provide for their own safety. And so like I would just say like, yeah, it's important that we think about how we resource that as well in terms of the way that we do the work.
Love that.
I think in addition to what's been said, the biggest tool that I can suggest is community. First interrogate who your current community is. The metaphor that I like to use is, you're driving the car, you may pick up people along the way, and you may realize that they need to get out at the next rest stop. Not everybody that's in the car at the beginning may be there at the end. And that's called growth. That's called, a journey. But I think in these times, you'll find that you have people within your circle who and listen, debate is great, but and not everybody, it doesn't have to be groupthink, but you may find that you have some fundamental differences with some of the people that are relatively close to you, and so you have to think about that. And then once you sort of cull the herd, being in community with like-minded people with similar goals, because there is safety in numbers sometimes, right? And so and there's definitely safety in resource sharing. And so it helps to broaden your community because, maybe he's doing something that I didn't even realize, existed, and I can provide, and, we can barter and we can share information, we can share resources. And those are tools that help keep us safe, because there are people like Nicole who's been through all of this, right? And so, I mean, there's just a wealth of knowledge there that I don't have, but I would love to be able to share that with others. So, community, I think, is the most important thing that I can suggest, the correct community, and an ever growing community, while ensuring that you are asking the right questions, as you bring people into your circle.
I would just add to that too. I think that's great, April. Like, there are communities outside the United States that have been dealing with this a lot longer than us, and we should be asking them how they have gotten away or been able to do things. And I think that's something that we really see at QLP, like because we work in, complex queer settings, that I'm like, well, we should just be talking to the filmmakers in China. Then how did they do this, right? And a great example is at one point the Beijing Queer Film Festival was completely shut down, and they bought tickets for their film goers, and like train tickets. So on the high speed between Beijing and Shanghai. And on the way to Shanghai, they were given a laptop with a USB, and the movie was ready, loaded. And then on the way back, they got a different USB, and they got to watch 2 films. I mean, that's amazing creative thinking, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, like I get so frustrated sometimes with Americans. I'm like, we're just not creative enough. Like we've got to like think outside the box. Like, yeah, like our stuff is getting shut down and stuff, but like it's new to us. And I think now we're like this victim setting of like, oh, I can't believe it's happening. And to your point, they're killing white people, and now white people are like, oh, that's us too now. Like, oh yeah. And like other folks are like people have been going through this, and so we have to see how. And I have to your point of community, I have a WhatsApp group of folks, and one of my really good friends is a executive director of an LGBTQ organization in Malaysia. Like what's going on in Malaysia right now, you can't even wear a Swatch watch because they think that Swatch watches are like a LGBTQ situation. And because of the different colors of swatches, and like literally you cannot buy a Swatch watch, and if you're wearing one, the government will come after you. And it's like, I talk to my friend all the time, like, what are y'all doing in Malaysia? Like, how is this? They just raided a so-called bathhouse in Malaysia and arrested like 200 people overnight. let everyone out the next day because they didn't actually have any like laws. But it's like, well, like, what did we learn from that? And how can we be prepared in the United States that if like a bathhouse is going to be raided, which is going to happen eventually, like, how do we protect these queer spaces? And I think that's really like community, to your point, April, is how we're going to do that.
Thank you. And to that note, I'd love to end with like a little call to action because this is Solidarity House, which means we're in solidarity with each other. And I think the question is, what must we all collectively commit to in order to get to this space of real artist safety right now?
I think we just need to show up and listen and not try to be perfect. I think perfectionism or inherently goes to virtue signaling and then inherently stops the work from moving forward. We just have to show up and listen to each other and observe and stay dedicated and say, hey, I don't know what you're going through, but just tell me what you need. And I will show up as much as I can. And that's that's as simple as I can put it.
I was thinking something along a very similar lines, which is just like along this theme of like having to be, or the theme of a lot of the things that I've said is like in terms of having to be more under the radar, kind of undercover with things that you're doing. The result is that like we don't always know what people in our community are going through, and so like just check in with people. Like, Iabo said it yesterday in a session that she was doing with Elijah, which is just like pick up the phone and call people because I think increasingly we don't know what everyone else is kind of struggling with. And so like check on your people.
Yeah, especially your strong friends, right? The people who always look like they've got it together, but maybe crumbling inside. This is a really hard question. This is going to sound uh, very sophomoric, but do more, right? Figure out what that thing is that you are very passionate about. It might be climate change, it might be economic instability, it might be queer issues, whatever it is, and just do more. I think it's easier to do more, to figure, once you have found that thing that you're passionate about, whatever that is, right? And then find the organization, the grassroots boots on the ground organization that is actually doing the real work in your community and show up. And that could mean, if you don't have the time, that may be like an ongoing contribution of a small amount of money. That may be volunteering on the weekend or what have you. There is always something more that we can do, and we're all blasted. Like we're all incredibly tired. We all, are working 23 hours and 59 minutes of every single day. I get it. But I think this is the only way that we can do it. And, the fact that you're in the Solidarity House right now means that you're interested in doing something, right? Means that you understand that there is an issue and we need to come together as a collective people. And so, what is that one thing that you can do to make the world a little better?
Yeah, I've been telling people, equally, we're all exhausted. But we have to protect the protectors and defend the defenders. Like the people, like to your point, that you think are always okay, and the ones leading the organizations, they're really lonely. Like I have friends that run institutions, they're really lonely. And find those people and protect them because people are coming after them and get ready to defend them. Like, get ready to defend your best friend because like that's really where we're at.
So I'm hearing do more, defend. I'm hearing be in community. I'm hearing check on your people. I'm hearing pick up the phone. Yeah, I think those are all incredible calls to action. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining Solidarity House, which I think is really powerful to say that it's organized by a coalition of over 50 movement builders within and surrounding the independent film community. And so we invite you to hold close a reminder that solidarity across infrastructure means recognizing that our organizations are stronger when we share knowledge, pool resources, and coordinate strategy across the ecosystem. And so as we exit, as part of solidarity, community building, all the things we just talked about, the general call to action in this space has been to introduce yourself to two new people and share two things. First, it's share your most urgent yet accomplishable dream. And second, a challenge you are currently facing. Make one ask and one offer of support, but resist the need to be transactional, which I know is hard, but important. And trust that in solidarity, that this community is really caring for all. So thank you. Please check out the schedule for Solidarity House. You can go to thesolidarityhouse.com. And yeah, let's stay connected and continue to build. Thank you.